Well, good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to today's Wires Transmission webinar. My name is Larry Gastiger. I'm the Executive Director of Wires. And for today's Wires webinar, we have a presentation by Alex Lichman. Alex is a construction project manager for Bureau Veritas. And Alex is going to talk to us about some of the real world challenges to getting transmission built from a boots on the ground perspective. Alex has a PowerPoint presentation for us today. He's going to go through that presentation. We do expect to have some time for questions from any of the attendees at the end. So as you're watching, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them into the question function, which is on the right-hand portion of your screen. Just tap on that and type your question in. We'll have it for Alex, and we'll go through those questions at the end. So without any further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Alex. Anxious to see your presentation.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks for having me, everybody. This is the very first time I've participated in a Wires event, let alone presented at one. So I'd like to thank the Wires community for the opportunity to take part in such a fascinating event. You guys got a really neat group, and you guys are working on solving a lot of important problems and fostering some great discussions. So a little bit about me and my talk today. My talk is navigating the transmission and grid construction landscape. My name is Alex Lichman. I am originally from Mason City, Iowa, although I am currently temporarily residing in California in service of a construction project that is in progress. As far as transmission work and why this is important to me, I guess I can, just briefly touch on why I got into this line of work. My father was involved in this line of work. He was a journeyman lineman, and also later on in his career got into substation work as a general foreman. And it's really because of his career in this industry that I ever took in any interest in energy. Most people, when they drive down the road, all those power lines go unnoticed, but from a young age, it was something where when I looked out across the expanse and saw the infrastructure, I had a actual understanding of what all it takes to erect those structures and pull that wire, and as well as all the sacrifices that those men and women have made to put that stuff up. A little bit of a personal background on me and kind of how I got involved in this industry. Kind of had a varied career in a few different aspects. Started out my first ever job in this industry was a summer job while in college working for a power company. Started out pretty modest in a warehouse, inspecting material deliveries, taking inventory and picking orders. After that and after school, I worked for an engineering company where I was part of a great power delivery group focusing on transmission and substation design. And a lot of my time there is what I credit to teaching me what goes into a good design package. I've worked in the EPC space on the contracting side, fulfilling many roles from field engineering up through project management. But really, the work I am currently doing right now is my absolute favorite. And it's within Bureau Veritas, North America, specifically within the power division. And although I've spent the large majority of my career on the road in service of these projects, I've had the pleasure of traveling this great country for BV for the better part of 4 years. Most recently, just got done managing a 500 kV transmission line that spanned over 100 miles in the desert Southwest. I've met some incredible people along the way, and I've definitely learned a lot along this journey as well. Okay, before I get started, I'll tell you a little bit about the organization I'm a part of and where I fit in within that organization. So I'm a member of Bureau Veritas, particularly North America. The global group is quite large. BV is a world-leading provider in the testing, inspection, certification, and technical services space. It's also quite an old company. It was originally founded back in 1828, and the group currently has well over 80,000 employees. We have over 1,500 various office and laboratory locations, and we are active in 140 separate countries around the globe. We're involved in a lot, some of which is power, but a lot of other industries as well. And Bureau Veritas helps its clients to improve their performance by offering services and innovative solutions in order to ensure that their assets, products, infrastructure, and processes meet standards and regulations in terms of quality, health and safety, environmental protection, and social responsibility. BV is also listed on the Euronext Paris and belongs to the Next 20 index. Now, specifically within BV, I want to talk about the part of the group that I represent. I represent a group that works on construction management. And we do more than that. We offer on-site owner's engineering. We do a lot of pre-construction things. But me particularly, I'm focused on the construction management. So before I got into this presentation and in the prep, I really thought, what am I going to present on today? I know that there is a ton of brilliant engineers who discuss really complex problems and complex solutions, and that's all really, really important. But I got to thinking, what's unique about my perspective? And I think it's more the current role that I provide. So what do we do in construction management? Well, we provide experienced on-site resources to ensure successful project completion through our construction management service. Our major areas of focus during the construction phase are budget management and cost control. That can include invoice validation, things of that nature, technical issues support, managing RFIs, as well as just having some industry experience to be able to navigate some of the technical issues that arise. Schedule analysis, we do forensic analysis of schedule, going back and looking at all of the logic involved, making sure that it is sound and that what you see on paper is actually representative of the plan that you're going to get in the field. We work on permitting and compliance management. So a lot of these projects here are it's quite the effort to get them permitted and to remain in compliance. So that requires a lot of specific focus. We do contract administration. We have safety personnel, as well as all of our individuals are very well trained in safety and have an eye looking out for that on site, as well as reporting. We offer daily, weekly, monthly reporting constantly back to owners and developers. That's who we represent. We're owners, developers. And so I'm a representative looking out for their interests on site. And because of that, it's a unique perspective. One could say that we're kind of caught in the middle. And I say that with a smile on my face because that's right where we'd like to be. We are officially representing the owner, but we are an on-site role working day after day alongside the contractor throughout the construction phase and through energization. And I think that's a pretty unique perspective because in a way, we get a look behind the curtain on both sides. We're able to sit on both sides of the table, so to speak. We're able to see things that owners particularly are interested in, and we're able to see things that contractors specifically are focused on. And I think that's a pretty unique perspective. So I'm hoping that boots on the ground perspective is valuable to the team, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay. So what is the goal of this presentation? Well, really my goal of this presentation is to share lessons learned through recent on-site experiences. I know there's a lot of folks involved in policymaking and regulations and development, but I really want to share an on-site perspective because that's a perspective that not a lot of people see anymore. So what I hope to do is showcase some of the areas of these projects that give both parties, owners and contractors alike, the most difficulty and how we try to navigate them and some of the lessons learned as we navigate some of these complex problems. Some of the biggest areas that I think are of high difficulty for owners as well as contractors are on the environmental side. There's a big focus on pulling wire and all the work that goes into constructing this stuff, but typically on these projects, a lot of people run into the environmental side, and that's where they have a lot of their hiccups. And they don't realize until they get there that it's a behemoth to manage, and you really have to plan accordingly. I'm also going to, within the environment, I'm going to touch on land disturbance and how important that is, as well as biological and cultural resources, what those are, how we go about protecting them, and kind of how those processes work. After that, I would be remiss as a construction guy not to comment on safety, particularly stuff that's specific to transmission, like maintaining a safety culture despite long distances between personnel, as well as learning from typical incidents that we see out on site. Then, of course, there's some other topics related to public relations, just things that you should be doing if you're developing a project and making sure that we have good relationships with the public. I'm going to touch on some unforeseen circumstances that have popped up more recently, and kind of let everyone else know the difficulties we had with them, as well as talking a little bit about planning for future needs and how we can effectively do that. Okay, so to dial into the environmental aspect of these projects. Well, first off, transmission projects traverse large expanses of land. That's the entire point of transmission, to go from point A to point B. And a lot of times these large expanses typically are pretty underdeveloped. A lot of this land can be barren. So a lot of the lands we end up crossing are federal lands, where we'll have to work with folks like the Bureau of Land Management. You have state lands, county lands. Sometimes they own tracts of land that you have to traverse, as well as things like tribal lands and private lands, just your typical landowners. Once again, I'd like to reiterate, one of the largest aspects to managing these large transmission projects is the environmental side. I think it's most overlooked. This work is not just for biologists. It affects nearly all disciplines. I see it all the time, where people, if they have a biologist on site, they feel like they can't do any wrong, but it's really for everyone to have a focus on if you want to be successful, not make any mistakes. Okay, so further into environmental, I want to touch on one of the most important aspects to managing these sides of the projects, and that's land disturbance. Land disturbance is a massive deal when it comes to these projects, and quantifying your limits of disturbance is one of the most important processes during route approval. Why is this so important? Why do we put such an emphasis on this? Well, from an agency perspective, they are mostly interested in how much land you're impacting and how those impacts can be minimized. They're not really interested in the size of your cable or anything like that. They want to know what land you're disturbing, how we can minimize it, and really accurately mapping that. Land disturbance is also one of the largest budgetary items of any project, whether that be initially getting the access to the land or throughout the construction phase. A lot of these heavy civil contracts represent a massive piece of the pie as far as the project budget goes. So it's something to take pretty seriously. And another reason this is so important is what happens when you have impacts outside of the approved limits of disturbance? Well, when you have impacts outside of the limits of disturbance, and I might refer to that as LOD in short, limits of disturbance. When you do have impacts outside of the LOD, it exposes major risks to the project schedule. A lot of times we have the rights to move through an area, but if we get outside of bounds, what does it do? Well, usually that requires further survey. And when further survey comes, that means everyone goes through previously undisturbed land with a fine-tooth comb. And sometimes discoveries are made, and that could very well shut down your project, all because someone strayed off of an access road slightly. And trying to manage this is really, really trouble. When you have hundreds of people spread out over 100 miles in some instances, LOD violations are numerous, and it's really, really hard to police. It's also really hard to police which ones are contractor related versus public related, because a lot of this work takes place on public lands. But it's important to note also that violating these LODs can also introduce harsh disciplinary measures for those who stray outside. And take it from me, as someone who's had to let someone go before for going outside the LOD, it's a really, really tough thing to manage when you have that many people. And you end up having to really draw a hard line of zero tolerance in order to really effectively maintain that. So there's a huge importance of LOD adherence on site. So land disturbance. How exactly should land disturbance be defined? Well, I think we would all agree that grading is something that we would consider land disturbance, right? Of course, if you're cutting into the ground like that. But what about some of these other activities? Are they considered ground disturbance? For instance, light buggy traffic, not even pickups. I'm talking about the guys that go around on Polarises. If they stray outside the LOD, does that constitute land disturbance? In most cases, yes, it does. Let's get a little bit more obscure. Let's talk about cable dragging during wire stringing, particularly hard lines as we're pulling wire. What about when that cable comes over and droops down and touches the ground momentarily? May only provide a little inch wide, skid mark through the ground, but is that something that's considered ground disturbance? It's going to be really, really important for anyone who's involved in these projects to know. Careful planning and discussion on what activities constitute land disturbance can greatly improve your project experience. And why is that? Well, it's because all ground disturbing activities come with certain responsibilities, particularly when encountering sensitive resources. This is going to be extremely important when encountering sensitive resources. So, one of the first aspects to land disturbance is site preparation. Access is the very first thing that the project works on. And whenever those activities kick off, one of the first things that comes to my mind is, how is your project's map management? And why do I bring that up? Well, at first, what do you have? A barren expanse of land with no markers, nothing. And they have to go out and develop it. Far too often, we're seeing issues with GPS, people saying, oh, I glanced away, or I thought I looked at it a while ago, or my phone died, things of that nature. So I think it's really, really important to have physical copies on site at those structure locations when grading begins. Usually all these structures, they typically have temporary signage, something that would denote a structure number. It's really easy to attach a little weatherproof container and put maps there. That sort of thing will keep you out of trouble right out the gate when it comes to land disturbance, and making sure that grading activities don't immediately start with the LOD violation. Who is responsible for complying with the limits of disturbance? Well, as I mentioned earlier, this is not just for biologists. As a matter of fact, if you focus on just having the biologists focus on this work, everyone else is not going to, because they feel like it's being attended to. I've seen a lot of real issues with ownership at controlling some of these sites. When you're at a structure location, let's say like a 200 by 200 pad, guys going outside the footprint, things like that. And what's the first thing the foreman says? Oh, well, we have a biologist right there. They didn't say anything. Or, oh, my biologist wasn't here when we started work this morning. A lot of pointing the finger, and it's just not worth getting into. So what we recommend is having some sort of ownership at the foreman level. That could be accomplished in a few different ways. One thing that we like to see is kind of a site-specific review for environmental items. It could be as simple as some checklists and some basic things that a foreman or anyone should do before they start work that day. And it's signed by that foreman. That way there's ownership there, and if things go outside, you have someone responsible. And only after that ownership takes place, you really see these incidents start to dwindle down. What else goes into these land disturbances? Well, staking, right? Staking is an important part of access, something that seems extremely self-explanatory, but it's typically the very first miss on site. What do I mean by that? Well, people doing the bare minimum versus delineation in service of your crew and the people that will come after you at some of these locations. That's what I mean. And I have a specific example to show how something as simple as staking out these structures can really get someone in hot water. So hopefully everyone can see this. I got a Google Earth file of a structure. We will refer to it as structure X for these purposes. And what you're seeing is a 200 by 200 foot pad around. And this is kind of what we see for typical staking when people are initially going access. So ignore the structure, pretend none of this has been graded yet. What do we typically see? We see the corners, maybe one in the middle. These stakes are about 100 foot apart. Well, what's going to happen when a crew comes out here and they've done dozens of these over and over for days and days? What's going to happen is your dozer is going to line up on one of these corners. He's going to mistake which direction is the interior of this pad, and he's going to accidentally push dirt to the wrong side. And immediately, you're going to have yourself an LOD violation. If you are within federal lands or something like that, you have to self-report these things, and definitely do. That's very important. And here you are with a new project, a fresh reputation, and the very first thing that the agencies know about your project is that you can't keep people following simple maps. So something as simple as staking is very, very important and often goes overlooked. Once again, this is kind of an example of bare minimum staking that's problematic. Up here, I'll show kind of an improved plan. You'll notice how we added some around the corners here, kind of making an L shape, making it very obvious what's on the interior of the pad versus the exterior, as well as some more intermediary stakes, because some of this stuff is going to have brush, it's going to be hard to see. You want it to be plainly obvious for anyone that goes out there. That way you don't have any violations. Let's talk a little bit about biological resources. The areas we work are home to immeasurable biological resources, and sensitive species receive special attention and also introduce additional restrictions. On these projects, you really got to ask yourself, what season is it? And what do I mean by that? Well, significant regions of the project could be off limits seasonally. Maybe it's bighorn sheep. Maybe it's bats that are roosting. There's all sorts of migratory bird things that you have to worry about. So there's portions of the project, if you're doing a lot of public land, that you should pretty much expect are going to be off limits seasonally. Now, are these restrictions fixed? I'm going to say mostly. And the reason I say mostly is they're there for a reason. If you are protecting biological resources like animals, and they have determined that it's good for those animals to have peace, usually there isn't much wiggle room on that. But there are processes that you can go through to potentially get special permission. But those are unique circumstances, and it has to be managed properly. Federally, a lot of this is called variances. There's probably people in the audience who have had to fill out these variances before. And on these variances, what are they exactly? Well, it's a form that you would send to an agency, and you would say, we are varying from our initial plan. And because of that, we are seeking permission to have this variance. And you have to outline a lot of things in that variance about why, what, how, all of those sorts of things. It's important throughout this process. You got to remember to demonstrate your understanding of the resources. Limit your scope of work, right? So one, you got to show you understand the resources that are going to be impacted. You're going to show that you're limiting the degree to which you are going to impact those. And you're going to showcase efforts on how to protect these species. And why is this so important? Well, a lot of it has to do with who is in charge of these approvals. Usually it's not a lineman, I can guarantee you that. Most of the time you're appealing to a biologist or someone in an environmental role. So if you're going to talk to them about potential variances or workarounds, how do you do that? You appeal to them from their background, right? We're going to demonstrate that, yes, although this animal is here, this is why we think it's of limited impacts to them. If you're worried about a lot of activity, maybe one of the things you can do in order to limit presence is, instead of having vehicles flying into an area all day, every day, maybe you can meet up early in the morning, have everyone caravan together, and maybe limit the amount of overall vehicles in the area to an actual trip count that you keep count of. Something like that. You want to be able to show throughout this process to the agency that you care about the resources, that you understand what sort of activities impact them, and that you're going through a lot of effort not to impact those resources. And if you are given approval of variants that would allow you some sort of special permission to work at a limited capacity in these areas, it's very important that you do not violate the rules of that variance. It's very important. Rules must be enforced. First off, more than likely, you're going to get checked. So if you're out there with the crew and you say we're going to have less than 50 people, well, at some point, someone might come out there with a little clicker and actually count. And as a matter of fact, your contractor should too, to keep your guys honest. So it's something that if we're going to get special permission and we're going to, leverage our reputation to do so and try to get a little bit of trust, do not burn that bridge. Enforce the rules, follow them to a T, and follow your variance. And think about all the stuff that you want in it from the get-go. It can ruffle some feathers sometimes when you have to go back and revisit and amend these sorts of things. So think things out very carefully. Don't just send them in willy-nilly. And with reason, I think that people are willing to hear common sense and approve them in a limited basis. Let's talk a little bit about cultural resources. Much like biological, the areas we work are also home to invaluable cultural resources. Most of the cultural details typically are under NDAs or non-disclosure agreements. And why is that? To limit attention. So if you have a project that spans many, many miles, a lot of it through public land, and they have knowledge of Native American artifacts or things like that, you're not actually going to know the very specifics of where they are. Or if you do, it's going to be a very short list of designated individuals who are focused on protection of them. So early on in the project, there's a very limited, widespread understanding of what's out there culturally. We might know some basics, right? We might know of the potential for cultural resources, but specifics have yet to be clearly defined. We might know an area is prone to harboring these resources and that protections are going to have to take place, but we might not actually know the true scope of how widespread that is. Now, this is important because we submit plans for protecting these resources, usually well before this area is precisely mapped. Like I said, we have a rough order of magnitude, we understand the region, but how much resources are actually there, usually pending some sort of additional survey. So how can this complicate things? Well, earlier we were talking about what constitutes land disturbance. And I talked about difficulties with string conductor over cultural resources. Does your hard line touching the ground count as ground disturbance? In some cases, yes. And what that means is it is a bear to manage. Let me share a specific example. So here we have an expanse of land, and you'll see a ton of lumber down. Early on throughout this process, I've had a contractor who proposed putting down lumber mid-span so that if the cable drags, it'll contact the lumber. Now remember, this area, cultural resources, right? That means we can't drive a truck in there. That means you can't drive a buggy in there. You are only approved what you can do on foot. And early on, this plan seemed reasonable. When you anticipate just a tiny bit of area mid-span that you have to protect, maybe 100 feet, it's not a big deal. But what happens when you only have one plan submitted and approved, and all of a sudden you get news back from a more recent survey and you find you have miles of right-of-way to protect? How does that go as far as revisiting that conversation and looking at new methods? Well, let's talk about, this is a pretty typical way of protecting here, where just the scope got out of hand. So let's talk about this a little more. Here's another example. Once again, imagine all the people that had to place this by hand, an astronomical amount of work. And how did we do that? How do we get all of these here by hand? Well, by helicopter. So to give you an idea of how big of a bear this was to manage, you would truck in endless truckloads of lumber. But the helicopter is usually a light duty helicopter to go over there because something larger produces too much rotor wash and once again impacts the environment. So you have a light duty helicopter that will come and pick up bundles of wood and take them out into the middle of the right of way, where then they will be handled by hand. Problem is, you actually had to do a lot of double handling here. So the bundles that came on the truck were too heavy for the helicopter. Everything had to be unbundled, rebundled, flown out, unpackaged, and then one by one, all of these individual pieces were placed. So that's kind of an extreme example of how this sort of thing can get out of hand here, but it can very easily get out of hand if you don't have a good plan in place for mitigating this. So let's talk a little bit in summary about the environmental side. Environmental management is an often passed over aspect of managing transmission projects. Strict enforcement of the project's LODs will limit site shutdowns and reputational harm. You need to empower staff to take ownership to make sure that we can limit those instances. It's also worthwhile to hire an environmental team that cares about what they do and can foster a relationship of trust with agencies. Someone that really does care about the resources out there, and it comes across naturally to anyone who's listened to them talk. That goes a long way. For protections like cultural, biological, develop short-term and long-term plans for protecting resources, because, you know, like I said, that plan for the lumber would have worked out great in a limited capacity. But when things really widened in scope, it turned into a behemoth to manage. And most importantly, very carefully define what constitutes land disturbance. You know, those photos of all that timber, we would all be remiss if not acknowledging that all those boots on the ground and all of that lumber that got placed on the ground overall represented magnitudes more of disturbance compared to when that cable drug, right? I think if you're to look at the lesser of the two evils, it's pretty obvious. So in these circumstances, appeal to reason over formality. I feel like sometimes, you know, plans are submitted and they're approved, and revisiting those is such a problem, right? A lot of times people are hesitant to do so. Appeal to reason. If you think there's something about your plan that is actually going to be worse off for the environment trying to implement it as approved, let the agency know. Talk to them about it. You might have to push a little past the initial person you're dealing with, but people do want to hear from reason. And at the end of that specific example, we did get feedback going, wow, how was that approved? Why would we have done that? Well, there was a huge appetite further up the food chain to be able to look and get more creative. But other people were intent upon enforcing, this is the plan that was submitted and approved. This is what you must do. So appealing to reason over formality in that goes a long way, and really trying hard to limit your cable drag as being defined as land disturbance. I've not seen, in those instances where you got really, really long right-of-ways and everything's peppered with resources, I have not seen a good way to do that. And I think we really should be trying to discuss this with agencies about telling them that any of the effort that we put in probably isn't worth it compared to the amount of disturbance that some of these other mitigation efforts create. Okay, let's talk a little bit about safety, particularly maintaining safety despite distance. That's one of the biggest struggles we have out here on these transmission projects, is the distance between. So how do we ensure that safe practices make it past the main office and down to each and every employee? And what sort of complications arise in such remote work? How do you mitigate those complications? What are some things to take into account when it comes to emergency response and coordination with that? And also, I'd like to touch on learning from typical incidents that we see time and time again. We'll go over all the usual suspects. We'll talk about what we actually see as the most prolific, and also share another specific example pertaining to splicing and some things we're seeing that we'd rather like to not see. Okay, maintain a culture of safety despite distance. Well, our work in transmission is generally very remote, and response times are typically very poor as well. So how can we mitigate that exactly? Well, one, giving muster points the respect they deserve, actually going and vetting them out and seeing if they pose any issues, not just looking at them on a map. It's not just in the yard or at a substation, but there's a lot of designated points throughout the line that make sense. Coordination with emergency services, helicopter coordination. What goes into them landing? What's it going to take as a landing zone? Do you have to pre-wet the area? Are there some requirements about it being pretty flat? Also sharing coordinates of structure locations or some of these muster points can be absolutely critical. Have a meeting with first responders, put this in their inbox and make sure they have a list. That way, if someone gets hurt, you can tell them structure 146 and they know where to go, they have the coordinates. And you guys can work to prepping a LZ. Culture is typically not hard to find at the main office, but what about out on the projects? Well, a lot of times these transmission projects have a lot of complications involving multiple laydown yards. So we get around that by having a rotating focus on safety, not just attending the main one, making it a point to go see those kind of smaller ones with smaller groups. And also some of the things we're seeing, what makes a good safety representative on this projects? Well, we're seeing a lot of people in industry excel in this, but we really are seeing ex-linemen be excellent safety guys. It's skilled work, it's specific work. They're familiar with it, and so long as they aren't part of the greater boys club, call a ball and a strike, make excellent safety representatives in this industry. So let's learn from some typical incidents. Usual suspects, right? We all know slips, trips, falls, pinch points, backing incidents, struck by, line of fire hazards. These are all things that we talk about all the time. And by all means, slips, trips, falls, things like that, they are probably the most numerous. But what about transmission-specific hazards? And what are we seeing major upticks in? Well, huge amount of this is driving, traversing the land, specifically as it pertains to water trucks. How can we improve conditions for this risk group? Well, one of the things is having a consistent meetup location at the start of work. When you have hundreds of people in construction like this and traveling construction workers, there are some folks that go out at night and have too much fun and think that they are prepared to go to work the next day. A lot of incidents that we're seeing are because of people showing up to work and them actually being under the influence still, but no one noticing it. And they get in their truck and go on about their day, and then an accident happens or distracted driving. So having a consistent meetup location has like a point of accountability where they're able to talk to a crew before they head out. Also, reasonable suspicion training. Make sure all your foremen and these people leading these toolbox talks and tailboard meetings understand that and know what to look for. It's more than just being drowsy, but having a special eye for that can be really important. And if things really getting out of hand, we've seen some people implement telematics if needed because there was such suspicion over distracted driving. That's kind of a last resort, but it's something that could be approached. What else in transmission are we seeing specifically? Well, I think the industry still has a long way to go for equipotential zones, EPZs. I think most people understand the basics and kind of go through the motions with their setup, but when you see it actually in place, we're seeing sloppy usage of it. So I think that's something that we should be looking out for on these projects is a lot of these contractors put up their EPZs, and once they're up, it's almost like they're not there. Making sure that they're staying vigilant. And rockfall protection. Some of these really steep areas, we're so focused on the hazards specific to our work that we often don't think about rocks that haven't moved in a long time. But if you're in steep areas, maybe you got people uphill from you working on micropile foundations. Think about those vibrations and what sort of rocks could fall down and how to protect people underneath and having a process for how to approach uphill. and splicing instance. I have a specific example related to splicing that I'd like to share with the group. Okay, so excuse the photos. I'm trying to limit personnel, but here we have splices for transmission. You can see the splices in the air here. This is it on the ground with the press. This particular one's a DMC press, although it's all somewhat similar. So as these guys go to crimping these connections, linemen take a lot of pride into having these splices nice and straight. And sometimes using presses like this can cause like a little bit of a banana effect in these splices. So what we're seeing guys starting to do, keep in mind, you got cable under tension on either side. Then it is caught in rigging to give you slack in the middle of the cable, and that's where your splice is done. Well, what we're seeing guys do in an attempt to keep their splices straighter is they will put in a crimp or two at the very interior to hold onto the cable, and then they will start coming out of their rigging and allowing that tension to help pull things straight as they make the rest of their presses. For obvious reasons, that is not good practice. Had instances in the past where crimp failed, and next thing you know, the line shot out like a rubber band after it snapped, and luckily no one was hurt. But we're seeing a lot of that, and you know, we prefer the bananas compared to cutting corners like that. So in summary on safety, despite long distances, safety culture can be mitigated by doing the following: improving response time through local coordination with emergency services, ensure they have coordinates of structures, muster points, etc. Go over your LZ requirements and ensure you're ready for a landing. Give all laydown yards the attention they deserve, not just the main yards. Learning from incidents across the industry, it's important to do the following: focus on driving, as it will become one of the largest contributing factors towards incidents on your projects. And having a consistent meetup location in the mornings, making sure everyone's just not loosely going out onto the right of way with no plan, and making sure leaders are prepared to be able to sniff out any reasonable suspicion. Ensure that your contractor is up to speed with EPZ requirements. Give thought into falling rocks when working in tough terrain, and when doing splices, ensure the contractor keeps all rigging attached until the splice is fully pressed. Okay, public relations. I want to talk a little bit briefly on this as well. These transmission projects impact the public in a number of ways: road and trail closures, usually negative ways, right? Usually if we impact the public, it's stuff they don't like. That's what we hear about. So it's road closures or trail closures where we get in people's way. Maybe a landowner, someone didn't close a gate, now you got lost cattle. Maybe guys aren't cleaning out the back of their trucks and they're on the highway and now it's littering the highway full of trash. Or maybe there's a house just along the right of way that is getting completely dusted out. There's a lot of the ways that we impact the public, whether they like it or not. And we really try to do what we can to respect them and to minimize these impacts. You know, if you have road or trail closures, specifically trail closures in the public, make sure you post that, you know, let people know. Make sure you fulfill any obligations of who owns the land. Lost cattle, if you go into someone's property and they make a point of telling you to shut the gates behind you, make sure you do so exactly as they say. Pick up after yourself and keep these roads wetted down, especially right in front of the public's house. There are also multiple opportunities to positively impact the public. Event sponsorship, if they have some sort of music festival or carnival or something going on in some small town, I would strongly recommend, if there's an owner developer, that you take part and offer some degree of sponsorship. Have something positive to associate your name with, as well as any material overages. Like, for instance, all that wood that gets put down, well, after it bakes in the sun, for that cultural protection example, it gets warped. That wood is no good to you to use for dimensional lumber or building material. So what happens? Well, the public got a lot of excellent dry firewood. And even though it was a pain in the rear of everyone involved, it was a huge hit amongst the public and went a long way for our local reputation. Make sure when we communicate with the public, if a promise is made to someone, do your best to keep it. Your reputation is very, very important, and coordination is key to maintaining that trust and reputation. Okay, unforeseen circumstances. A couple things popping up that we think have the potential to impact your projects. Despite all of our efforts to plan, things will pop up and catch people off guard, particularly outage securement. It is very prone to seasonal availability. So if you're crossing another energized source, that's something where your outage may not be granted. And I know a lot of people know that, but I would even say, if you're doing stuff in the summer and the time where demand is high, expect that a large majority of your outages aren't going to be granted. And how do we plan for that exactly? Well, talking with your contractor early. When you look at these wire pulls from the very beginning, have them assess the feasibility and comfortability, very important, comfortability of all crossings in the event that doing the work hot remains a viable option, and have a backup plan ready for submission. We always try to work de-energize. We work like heck to make sure that, if we can, we always remove energies from these sources. But there are some instances where more and more outages aren't being granted, and you have to be ready and understand any limits that your contractor has with the work. Maybe there's one particular pole that they don't feel comfortable doing hot, and there's nothing they're going to budge on. That's going to be important for you to know early on so you understand what's on the table. Energization delays. We're seeing some of these. Your project is ready, but what about anyone else? We're seeing this more and more. Regional authorities that might have requirements outside of your control. Maybe you're bringing a power line into the system, but unaware to you, another communication line that you don't even own is considered a path of redundancy in some way, or is critical to the region, and maybe they had some storm damage or something specific that affected that redundant pathway. And now the regional authority in your area might say, nope, you cannot come live until this is fixed. Stuff like this can happen, and we want to make sure we're asking some of the other people that we're taking part in these projects with, particularly authorities in the regions, your ISOs and such. Let's see, material issues. Have a strong initial inspection process to evaluate compliance with requirements. Notate any deficiencies immediately with the vendor. That way they can get addressed. Don't wait. And briefly, because I can see we got about 10 minutes left, so I'll run through this. Planning for future needs. Getting these projects off the ground takes a monumental effort. So try to anticipate your future needs and account for them in the first crack at the design. If a station is being built, a substation, switch yard, series compensation station, what have you, think about expansion and what that requires of your approved footprint. Get that land the first time. It's much easier than trying to get it much later. If you're cutting in a station into an existing line, plan for that with your structures. Maybe worthwhile to put a dead end somewhere instead of getting caught between miles and miles of guide V structures and then having to cut in a station, where that can be really problematic. And lastly, procurement-wise, does your equipment have prohibitively long lead times? I would say yes. We are seeing lead times in this industry continue to push out. So do not wait for the situation to improve. Get your orders in. We're seeing stuff take years, and it is getting longer. So waiting and hoping for it to improve, not a good idea. Try to get your stuff in as early as possible into the queue. And there's always unrealized future impacts. There's all sorts of world politics and local politics, regarding the docks on either coast, as well as natural disasters like we saw down in North Carolina, where they're going to have to rebuild a substantial part of their grid that you're also competing for resources on. So, go with what you know now. It's hard to plan for the future, but get your place in line. That's our recommendation, and get it early, because you never know what's going to happen in the near future and what sort of impacts that can have, particularly if your materials aren't sourced domestically. Okay. Well, I think I got a few minutes left. Thank you all for taking the time to hear my presentation. It was a pleasure. And at this point, I would like to open it up for question and answer.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. That was really interesting. Appreciate it, particularly hearing the perspective of what it's like actually being out there in the field dealing with some of these issues. A lot of us um, are focused on it from a legal, a regulatory perspective, and don't really have the perspective that you've added. So appreciate that. I'll just say if anybody does have any questions, please submit them over in the question box. I've got a couple I want to put out there for you to respond to, and if we get additional ones, that's fine. But we are running close to the top of the hour. One of the topics I wanted to ask about, because you mentioned this in one of your earlier slides in terms of the role that you play, which was on cost control. And I wanted to know, can you elaborate a little bit more on how cost control factors into the construction process? And what are some of the cost control measures that would typically apply to transmission projects? And then how do you balance cost control with other concerns like safety and environmental issues? So that's quite a bit, but I thought cost control is a big issue. Cost management is a big issue right now on transmission projects. And I'd like if you could elaborate it a little bit from the real world perspective of what it means for getting transmission built.
Yeah, absolutely. So in transmission, some of the things we look out for cost management are one, we're kind of the eyes and ears on site for these owners as change orders are submitted. So there's a lot of management going into making sure that they're valid change orders and that costs are accurately captured, as well as we keep our ear to the ground and suggest ideas sometimes, maybe a valued engineered option. Maybe there's a schedule in jeopardy, but the foundations are extremely overbuilt, right? So maybe what we could do is through engineering prove that the foundation can go down in size and diameter by a foot or two, and the amount of time and materials you save would be substantial over the course of a project, and you just saved yourself a month on the schedule, which would obviously have major cost implications as well in the positive, as far as credit back for lack of materials used, as well as just time is money. So that would be an example of kind of some of the cost management that we take care of in field.
And from the other side of the coin, if you're experiencing a situation where costs are unexpectedly on the rise over what was anticipated, presumably you're keeping in close contact with the project owner and keeping them informed so they can help try to manage that process as well.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And a lot of it is, ensuring that the right procedures are followed. Anytime there's change orders or something being discussed, we all have, and this comes into a little contract management, but there's requirements for notice. There's certain documents that must be submitted when you have a notice of a potential impact, right? Starting when you're first trying to put down a rough order of magnitude. So a lot of those communications are vitally important.
Another area I wanted to talk about where we're hearing a lot on is concerns about having enough of a skilled workforce to work on all of these projects and get them done on a timely basis. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of the skilled workforce needed to build transmission, what some of the challenges are with making sure you've got an adequate skilled workforce to get these projects done?
Yeah, it is continually a challenge. I think this industry in particular is one that's experiencing a little bit of a vacuum right now of experience. There is no shortage of old guys with a tremendous amount of experience to impart on the younger generation. We're starting to see more and more people get involved in line work, but it's still not quite as popular as it needs to be to support all the goals that we have in this country for energy production. So I think, we really need to focus on making more people aware and getting them into schools and interest in this trade and letting people know how good of a trade it is and what sort of lifestyle it can provide for you and your family.
Great. Well, Alex, thank you very much. Really appreciate your taking the time to walk us through some of this today. I thought it was very interesting and informative. So I want to thank you and Bureau Veritas for taking the time to put this presentation together. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure. It really has being able to present here. Wires is a great community, and we plan on participating more in the future with your group.
Well, that's great. So for everybody who's tuned in, I just want to mention our next webinar is scheduled for Friday, November 22nd. It's going to feature a presentation by another Wires member, AmpJack. It's going to focus on a new structure, exoskeleton structure that they've developed that can be used for enhancing both capacity and resilience needs associated with transmissions. So keep an eye out for that one. It will be coming later next month. So with that, we're going to bring this particular webinar to a close. Thank everybody for attending. The webinar will be posted on the Wires website for anybody who'd like to revisit it again. And thank you very much for your attendance today. And thank you, Alex.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody.
All right,
Take
goodbye
care.
now.